This is what we are told about the origins of prism lighting. Prism lighting is found on flat-topped walk-on skylights, known as pavement lights in the United Kingdom, vault lights in the United States, or floor lights and sidewalk prisms that were set in sidewalks or floors to let sunlight into the space below. Prism lighting was the use of lighting to improve the distribution of light, usually daylight, within a space. It is a form of anodolic lighting, which refers to using non-imaging mirrors or lenses and light guides like fiber optics to capture exterior sunlight and direct it deeply into rooms, and scattering rays to avoid glare. Sounds like a form of advanced renewable lighting technology that did not involve energy generation like electricity does. Anodolic lighting prisms were frequently used, for example, to throw light sideways under buildings. Yet we are told prism lighting was only popular starting from its introduction in the 1890s until cheap electric lights became commonplace in the 1930s, at which time prism lighting became unfashionable. This is only a small sample of places around the world known to have prism lighting. Amsterdam, Budapest, Chicago, Dublin, London, Philadelphia, Sacramento, San Francisco, Saskatoon, Seattle, Tijuana, Toronto, Vancouver, and New York City. It is interesting to note that the vault lights of the old Pennsylvania station in New York City were concreted over, though still visible from the railroad tracks there, right before it was demolished in 1963. The original Pennsylvania station was said to have been built in the early 1900s and first opened in 1910. Why build a massive, ornate structure like this only to tear it down after only 53 years of use? Makes no sense. So the story that accompanies so many of the world's historic train stations, like Pennsylvania Station, of being demolished after a very short period of time, compared to the size and elegance of the architecture, is very similar to that of prism lights becoming unfashionable after only 40 years of existence in our historical narrative. This is also similar to what we are told about trains replacing canals, right after both were said to have been constructed as the preferred mode of transportation, supposedly because of trains being faster and more efficient. This is the B&O Railroad, where it is side by side with the C&O Canal at Point of Rocks, Maryland. Both projects were said to have broken ground on the exact same day, July 4th of 1828. The same story is told about electric streetcars. A great example is the electric streetcar system of Montgomery, Alabama, one of several called the world's first, starting operation in 1886, known as the Lightning Route, which for some reason was only in operation for 50 years, until 1936, at which time we are told the streetcars were retired in a big ceremony and replaced by buses. All of these sound like big steps backwards to me, and not examples of the wonderful progress we were said to have been making in the historical narrative we are taught.
The metropolis of today, New York City, 1939. A blend of yesterday and today, with its buildings and streets in familiar colors, familiar patterns, familiar forms. Here are the materials we have used for years, architectural forms to which we are accustomed, life as we know it and live it today. Our camera sweeps the horizon, turning in the direction of tomorrow. For here, beside the city of today, visible from its tall towers, man has built a prophecy, projected a dream, created the world of tomorrow. In the distance we see it, shining white in the sunlight, with its giant pylon and perisphere symbolizing the patterns of a new day, the New York World's Fair. It has been calculated that it would take a person 2 weeks to walk through all the exhibits in this largest of all World's Fairs, without pausing to examine them in detail. But let us skim the surface for a few moments, glimpse the contours of the world of tomorrow. feel some of its excitement, color, and human interest, and examine in some detail one of its most beautiful buildings. Here, literally, is the greatest show on earth, and through these gates come visitors from all over the world. Crowds? It wouldn't be a World's Fair without them. And everything that a crowd loves: bands, gay flags, picturesque costumes and folk dances, color and movement, and never a dull moment. Every World's Fair celebrates something. This one celebrates the 150th anniversary of George Washington's inauguration as the first president of our country. It also wouldn't be a World's Fair without the participation of other countries. Here are the exhibits of many nations. To step into these buildings is to step into other lands and view foreign art, industry, craftsmanship, and culture, pridefully contrived and beautifully displayed. The United States government, in its own beautiful buildings, gives an account of its stewardship, and the states have their own displays, dramatizing their attractions, their products, their history, and their progress. On every side is the beautiful and the strange. Man-made waterfalls designed as an integral part of buildings, thundering in an incredible cascade, fountains leaping and dancing in the sun, flowers and lovely landscaping, unsuspected angles and vistas, a paradise for the camera fan. There's so much to see and wonder at. Now and then we simply have to stop for rest and refreshment. That's the idea. By the time we're through with those ice cream cones, we'll be ready for more of the world of tomorrow. For the real accent on tomorrow's world, look to the exhibits of industry and trade. For here are the forms and patterns of the new day, the fascinating new materials that are being introduced, the advances in technology, the things that will affect the way we dress, eat, work, play, travel, and live. Here are the advances in metals and plastics, the drama of progress in electricity, gas, oil, rubber, glass, the new materials for the building of homes, the new in-home furnishings and housekeeping, the improvements in communication and transportation, the authentic forecast of life as it will be lived in the world of tomorrow.
This is what we are told about the history of prism lights. They first originated as deck lighting aboard ships as a safe alternative to candles, oil, and kerosene. Then a patent was issued to one Edward Rockwell in 1834, which was considered to be the first pavement light, but that the large lens was exposed directly to traffic and, well, if one broke, left a large hole that was unsafe for pedestrians in the pavement. Then in 1854, Thaddeus Hyatt corrected these faults of the Rockwell pavement light by using many small lenses set in a wrought iron frame that included raised nubs to improve traction in the event of wet weather and protect them from damage and wear. The interesting thing about Thaddeus Hyatt is that he seems better known as an abolitionist and friend and supporter of the infamous John Brown, who was executed after the failed Harper's Ferry raid during the American Civil War. Hyatt was investigated by the Senate following the unsuccessful raid and jailed for a brief period of time for refusing to testify about the raid, and was released from jail after the Senate committee investigating the raid was dissolved. The Brown Brothers Manufacturing Company was established in Chicago in 1858 and was said to have been the sole manufacturer of Hyatt's patent prismatic cement and lead band sidewalk lights and vault lights, floor lights, skylights, and deck lights. In 1872, the Brown Brothers Company was credited with, over the course of 8 months, of laying 2 miles or 3 kilometers of sidewalk lights in Chicago. When the president of the company, Edwin Lee Brown, died, his obituary read in part, "Since 1856, Mr. Brown had been prominently identified with the growth and public interest of Chicago, actively cooperating with philanthropic movements, and ever animated with a desire to elevate humanity. Later he became connected with Hyatt Brothers of New York and was at the time of his death engaged in the same business, that of manufacturing sidewalk lights, of which Hyatt is the patentee. Those with whom he was associated in the different fields of humanitarian effort sincerely mourn his death. It was in Mr. Brown's capacity as director of the Interstate Industrial Exposition Company that at the annual meeting held on November 14th of 1885, he offered the following famous resolution. Resolved, that it is the sense of this meeting that a great World's Fair to be held in Chicago in the year 1892, the 400th anniversary of the landing of Columbus in America. The resolution, seconded by R.W. Hare, was unanimously adopted, and it is said to have been the first suggestion made at a public meeting regarding such a celebration. The architecture for the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, also called the Columbian Exposition and the White City, was said to have been constructed exclusively and temporarily out of plaster, cement, and jute fiber for this World's Fair, and designed by John Wellborn Root, Frederick Law Olmsted, Daniel Burnham, and Charles Atwood in French neoclassical architecture as the prototype of what a city should be. It opened in May of 1893 and was largely demolished following the end of the World's Fair in October of 1893. In 1871, in London, the Hayward brothers were said to have patented a semi-prism by changing the shape of the glass by adding pendant prisms to the underside, reflecting the light sideways under the main building. The pendant shapes were right-angle prisms, which reflected all light sideways. Apparently, there was a lot of underground infrastructure that needed lighting in 1870s London. In 1885, James Gray Pennyquick of Chicago had a patent recorded for window glass with horizontal prisms on the inner surface. He founded a company called the Radiating Light Company in Chicago in 1896. His backers included Cyrus McCormick of the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company, later known as International Harvester, George A. Fuller, said to have been heavily involved in the building of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, and Charles Wacker, a brewer and director of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. The Radiating Light Company soon became known as the Luxfer Prism Company in 1897, at which time Pennyquick's design was said to have been introduced commercially by Luxfer. Luxfer? Lucifer? Now, for those of you who think Luxfer is a benign play on words for a name that is said to mean light bringer or light bearer, keep in mind there is a segment of Earth's population that actively worships Lucifer and wants Earth to be ruled by Lucifer, and this has very destructive elements that most of the population is unaware of because they don't know what's been going on here. They have to tell us what they are doing. They get around it by not telling us they are telling us, and they lie to us all the time. I firmly believe all of these prism lights were part and parcel of the original advanced ancient civilization, with credit attributed to others to explain their existence in this historical narrative. And I don't know what to tell you if you believe that the buildings of the 1893 Chicago World's Fair were actually made to be temporary and taken down. What really took place was the deliberate destruction of the beautiful architecture of the original positive human civilization. We are told this Luxfer prism design depicted here was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright as the only one of 41 designs he drew for the Luxfer Prism Company that was ever produced. It was described as having lines of ornamentation produced upon the prism light by variations in the surface levels. These ornamental lines take the form of circles, arcs of circles, squares, and the like, arranged concentrically about the center and interlacing or overlapping each other. The whole forms a grid-like sort of ornament. This pattern became one of Luxfer's standard accent tiles and was mass-produced, we are told. We are told that by the end of 1898, just a year after its formation, the American Luxfer Prism Company had offices in over 12 cities, completed 1,800 contracts, and placed $700,000 worth of product in buildings around the country, including in Chicago, the Rookery Building and the Chicago Stock Exchange. All of this information about things being patented that were actually already there leads me into wondering if, for example, the historical U.S. Patent Office played the same role as the Smithsonian Institution in covering up true history. This is the old U.S. Patent Office, said to have been built between 1836 and 1867, with this image of it said to be circa 1846. Today, the old patent building houses two Smithsonian Institution museums, the National Portrait Gallery and the Smithsonian American Art Museum. We are told that the original designer of the building in the Greek Revival design, Robert Mills, was removed for incompetence in 1851, and that the building was eventually completed under the direction of the Dean of American Architecture during that time, Thomas U. Walter, in 1867, around the end of the American Civil War. Then in 1877, a fire in the building's west wing destroyed some 87,000 patent models and 600,000 copy drawings. This is said to be a picture of one of the old patent office's model rooms between 1861 and 1865, which would have been all of the years of the Civil War. And the Kogod courtyard of the now National Portrait Gallery of what was the old patent office, complete with skylights and 3 rectangles filled with water that ripple across the ground plane. A subject related to prism lights are coal hole covers, said to have covered the access to underground coal bunkers when coal was the primary source of heating, we are told from the early 1800s to the mid-1900s. And then there was the existence at one time of ventilating hitching posts. So what exactly was a ventilating hitching post, shown here on the sidewalk at street level? There's not much information out there about them. Let's break down the definitions. To ventilate means to cause air to enter and circulate freely in a room or building. A hitching post is defined as a post to which a horse or other animals can be tethered to prevent from straying. What possible purpose could a ventilating hitching post have served, given the elaborate design and below-ground construction of the vent and flange of the one depicted here? And flanges are associated with chimneys, and indeed, according to this image, ventilating hitching posts were used in some cases as chimneys, with a stovepipe entering the bottom, used largely in San Francisco. So there were underground chimneys in San Francisco? What are we actually being shown here? How does all of this tie into the mud flood? There's just all kinds of evidence out there just beneath the surface of our awareness that there are many levels of underground infrastructure in many places that was being utilized during the 1800s, when, according to our historical narrative, we were at a much lower level technologically. So how could it have been built then? And these prism lights were somehow installed after the fact in order to utilize that underground space? And then prism lights and their natural lighting became unfashionable and was subsequently replaced by the electric light, which then had to be paid for? So the drawing pictured here is from an 1865 catalog and found in illustrations of iron architecture from the same year. Historically, 1865 was the last year of the American Civil War, when horses and horse and buggies were the main form of transportation, and soldiers with serious injuries to their limbs just had them sawed off, and if they were lucky, they had a leather strip to bite on and copious amounts of alcohol to dim their consciousness. You know, that's what comes to mind when I think of what we were taught about those times. Not the kind of building technology that produces several basement levels under buildings, sidewalks, and roadways.
So during the Civil War, they don't know what starts infections, but they see the effects of it. So if I see a lot of damage, I know I've got to amputate this. The way I check it with the probe is my finger.
That's gross.
Whoop. What's that? What's that? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, there's a lot of damage. I think I'm going to have to do an amputation. But we have razor-sharp amputating knives. By the way, in the toolkits they had during the Civil War from the factory. All the bladed instruments were dull. The surgeons were expected to sharpen all their own knives. So basically they'd get that sharpened knife, go back the rag, cut it like this. Now, gotta cut the bone. Now if you'll take your hands, you're not a piano player, are you?
Nope.
Good. Okay, if you put one hand here and one hand here, the other way. Okay. Just chiseling, just bend. And I'll pry back so exposing the bone. Then I'll get this saw with that.
Yes.
Cut it like that, and then throw it out there. Good reflexes on the right side. The next thing we have to do is tie off the major arteries. That took most of the time on these surgeries. By the way, 20 minutes to put them out. Typical surgery like this, 30 minutes. They were very, very fast. But this took most of the time. Now what they have to do, you can release now. Good, good. The cut along here kind of looks like hamburger covered with ketchup in real life. And it's just covered, you can't really see anything. It's just a mass of mush. So what they have to do is release the tourniquet. The heart's been pumping the whole time, but it's stopped the flow right here. When they release the tourniquet, the arteries can be found by looking for the spurts of blood coming through the muscle tissue. And they'll use a device called a canaculum. It's kind of like a fish hook. And an artery is kind of like your aquarium tubing. It's very tough. If I can just snag it, I can pull it right out and then tie it off with suture material. They do not cauterize hot iron. So they tie off with cotton, silver, thread, or especially in the South when they ran out of supplies, horsehair work just great, especially for internal surgery because it's biodegradable. So they would loosen the tourniquet and then watch for the, there's an artery, there's another, there's another one. It just kind of squirts like rubber hose, doesn't it? Yeah, there it is. And then tie each of those off. Now the next thing is to pack the wound, especially if it was infected. In this box, the top piece, if you pull that out, it's called Sharpay. The warswomen who followed the armies, excuse me, would cut 4-inch squares into sheets, old sheets, and meticulously pull them out thread by thread. And then if you reach under the gauze, they would tie them into bundles, 50 or so. Good. And then push those bundles together and tie them. In your time, it's called gauze. Well, that hasn't been named or invented during the Civil War. That's what they used to pack wounds. And if I could have that bloody chunk of it right there. If there's any parts, just put it at the bottom of the can. They would usually wet this, shove it in here with suture material, partially close it up, especially if it was infected. Back and forth, changing this dressing every 2 to 4 hours. And do that for days or weeks or more, and slowly close this thing up until the patient healed or died of infection. A good surgery such as this, because of infection, and because I don't know to wash my hands or my tools, I have no clue to do that. Half of them will die from a typical operation like that. So that was your big casualty rate that you heard about in the Civil War. So the next thing we're going to do, let's kind of go ahead in time, is to wake the patient up. We simply do that with a fan and give them fresh air.
Then there's the example of the vaulted sidewalks of the City Hall of Morgantown, West Virginia, that is loaded with evidence for the mud flood. It was said to have been constructed in 1924 with a smooth limestone facade and a grand central arched entrance, flanked by 2 bays, once home to the fire engines of the fire department, and the building also contained the police department and the jail. In more recent years, the building has been occupied by city government offices. The arrow is pointing to the building's disappearing windows and the steep street beside it, classic mud flood evidence. A request for proposal for repairs to the vaulted sidewalks was issued in 2018 because the sidewalks above the vaulted spaces required shoring up to hold them. We are told the vaults below the sidewalk of the City Hall entrance were intended to include mirror image men's and women's bathrooms with skylights. This is what that looks like. This design sure looks odd to me. And these are examples of the condition of the vaults underneath the sidewalk of the City Hall. All of the examples in this video are provided as evidence as to why you might live in a mud-flood city if your location has things like pavement, prism, vault, floor, and sidewalk lights, coal hole covers, and ventilation hitching posts.